Welcome back to Paris, Lesbos, and what I think is season 2, though that would make it 4-year-long seasons. I don't know how to feel about that, Pixie.
I mean, maybe it's kind of that BBC type thing. Everything comes out real slow and takes forever to end a season.
Anyway, today's subject will be familiar from the end of season 1. She gained a magazine as alimony before gay marriage was legal, and followed her ex and her ex's new girlfriend on a trip with an odd mystic to Paris. It's Jane Heap.
All right, so we have some parts of this story from other episodes, but tell us about this woman in particular.
Well, as always, we start at the beginning, something that you'll find most books mentioning Jane Heap do not do. They all love to start with her meeting Margaret Anderson in 1916, but we'll be going back to 1883 Topeka, Kansas instead.
Oh, so she has a life before romance? I don't know about that.
She does, but it isn't much recorded, hence while we skip from her birth year straight to her graduating high school and moving to Chicago to attend the Art Institute of Chicago. While there, it appears that she won a bunch of awards and worked as a night teacher at the Lewis Institute. During this time, she met fellow student Florence Reynolds, the daughter of a prosperous Chicago businessman.
Okay, so she's making connections.
However, despite her job, Jane didn't make enough money, so she had to return to her parents in Topeka for 2 years, 1908 to 1909.
So this wealthy connection isn't helping too much.
Not at the moment, but the two continued to correspond and then took a trip to Germany in 1910. By this point, they were lovers, but it was a short-lived relationship.
I was going to ask.
On their return to Chicago months later, they were only friends, which they remained for the rest of their lives.
Wow, all right. So that is an important interlude there. What else happens before she meets Margaret Anderson and starts her life?
Some things definitely happened, but most people don't record them, and I do not have access to everything.
Got it. So, hopping from one lover to the next.
Yeah, we're indeed skipping to Margaret Anderson. Jane joined the Little Review, the magazine started by Anderson without a plan and initially supported by one enthusiastic fan's salary from an unrelated job. If you want the full story on that, there's the Margaret episode 2 episodes back. Jane met Margaret in February 1916, according to the biographer Andrea Barnett. Heap had walked into the office of the Little Review after an heiress Margaret dubbed 19 Millions visited. Jane's comments on 19 Millions' statements about art caught Margaret's attention. And no, Pixie, the biographer did not record the words of that exchange.
They are shrouded in mystery.
It did spark the relationship that June between Heap and Anderson, though. However, this was not the end of 19 Million's cameo. She invited Margaret to visit her in California that same year. Margaret, with a lack of tact, brought Jane with her.
Which is it a lack of tact, or is it like, I can't handle this lady and I want her to, be a buffer or something?
The interpretation I took from Barnett's writing is that Margaret just lacked tact. It did not cross her mind that this was a faux pas or would annoy anyone at all. And it did annoy 19 Millions. Hence, the trip ended quickly. Margaret stormed out in a huff as the heiress called Jane odious for a second time.
Oh, okay.
It really is astounding that this is the same woman who essentially talked her way into financing her magazine in no time.
Wow. So, sometimes she has a way with words, and sometimes emotions happen.
In the end, they continued their trip in California, but they spent 5 months in San Francisco together, where they worked on the Little Review at night by kerosene lamplight.
Ooh, atmospheric.
Now, we haven't really delved that much into Jane, her personality, anything like that, so at this point I'll interject and say, for some reason, Jane is said to look like Oscar Wilde at this point in time. Having seen the photographs, I can't really see it. She usually wore oversized men's suits, and Margaret, who was otherwise oblivious to other people and their opinions, would sometimes ask Jane to change before going out.
Now, was this because it was like a bold statement to be wearing masculine clothes, or was this like a fashion police thing?
I think Margaret just didn't like being stared at so much when Jane was dressed like that.
Got it.
The writer Ben Stock also notes that Jane intimidated men and women alike, including Ezra Pound and Robert McAlmon.
Nice.
Her wit was also well known. For instance, she once called Robert McAlmon, the one-time husband of the poet Briar, an epileptic without gumption enough to have fits.
Oof.
It was Jane's manner of talking that Margaret liked, so I'll give you another example. When Margaret cried that life should be ecstasy, Jane replied, "Why limit me to ecstasy?"
So she doesn't like her fashion sense, but she likes her words.
Now, even at the start, Jane and Margaret quarreled. The historian Stephen Watson described them thus: Jane was the earth to Margaret's fire, the butch to her femme, the depressive to her hysteric. To be honest, I can see someone calling Margaret hysterical from what we saw in her episode. Further, Jane was more analytical and systematic compared to Margaret's whimsy, as seen in the fact Margaret referred to her memoirs as being a 30-year war with reality.
Yeah, they just have different ways of relating to the world, it seems like.
Their dynamic was not helped also by the fact that Margaret would purposefully rile up people to get Jane into an argument with them because she liked hearing Jane's wording.
Oh, she's showing her off.
In response, Heap observed, "It's an awkward role for me. You're the buzz and I'm the sting," or the fighting cock to be thrown in a ring, as the analogies went. Yet both women enjoyed this dynamic too. Jane felt she'd never encountered enough resistance in life before Margaret, who felt that for once her argumentative side was prized.
So they could kind of get into that as a way of showing each other off, or that's just such a weird thing to do.
I mean, no more weird than those shaving commercials where they would have duels between men and women as foreplay.
You're going to have to link that in the show notes. I think everyone needs to see that. But no, I hear you. There is something about, like, appreciating your partner being really good at something, and so putting them into a situation where they can be good at it. And I could see being at once annoyed that your partner would do that to you for no reason, but also kind of like, well, it's cute that she likes me.
But back to the timeline, Jane joined Margaret in the move with the magazine to New York, but unfortunately she got depressed as soon as she boarded the train. You remember that whole comparison of depressive to hysteric?
Oh, so that was not hyperbolic.
No, it was not. It gets showcased here with Margaret being miffed, for lack of a better word, that Jane flops face first on the hotel bed and keeps a revolver in the trunk in her studio while threatening suicide during these episodes.
Oh boy, so that's really serious. Is there indication that she was seriously considering it, or was that just kind of a life sucks, you know?
I cannot speak adequately to Jane Heap's mental state during this time, as a lot of people do not go that in depth with her. Mm-hmm. She's usually the side character in someone else's biography. So,
but it looks like the indication from Margaret is that she is miffed rather than, like, completely having a breakdown. So probably this is not, like...
Yeah, I say miffed because annoyed isn't the right word. She is worried, it sounds like, from the way it's described, but not as worried as one would typically be if their partner is threatening suicide.
Okay, so this is maybe partly, you know, when people on social media are like, oh, just kill me now or whatever. It's maybe at that level of, like, she's definitely not mentally healthy, but she's not on the brink.
We'll go with that.
I mean, but who's to say? Because we don't know these people.
They're dead, and the dead never pick up the phone. And now, together, they rented a small basement office in Greenwich Village for $25 a month, plus a cheap, shabby apartment nearby. And then they spent the next 6 years in a perpetual state of never knowing for sure if they could afford their morning coffee. At one point, they even subsisted on potatoes while continuing to maintain outward appearances of essentially keeping up with the Joneses.
I guess for what they're doing, they need to, like, that is the right priorities to make sure that the people that they want to have contact with, the other people in their artistic circle, feel like they are good enough to be in that circle.
As a writer, I feel like I would pay more attention to having food other than potatoes over whether or not I have the fanciest cloak on the block. Margaret called this the Little Review's most creative period, by the way. She also prepped Jane with hours of psychological gossip, as she called it, and then locked them both in with food so she could write down whatever pithy stream of consciousness sayings came out of Jane's mouth. Those were then changed into a column for the magazine every month.
Wow, that is like a whole process. It's giving me very grind set.
I mean, to me, I was having flashbacks to Colette's husband locking her inside and having her write the Claudine novels.
Yeah, no, it gives that vibe, except they're like both willingly doing this to each other.
Yeah, to finish this off, this was also the period where the other denizens of the village, like younger poets, dropped by the apartment to talk to them.
And I guess we're fine with all the squalor, because that's what bohemians do.
I mean, there's numerous jokes about us being poor for a reason. This also leads into that time that Jane and Margaret were arrested for obscenity for printing chapters of James Joyce's Ulysses. They managed to print 3 sections, and the 4th landed them in court. They were found guilty, charged $100, and rushed to a police station to be fingerprinted.
Sounds scary. I bet this has not happened to either of them thus far.
Now, while we have seen what Margaret thought of Ulysses, I've found mixed opinions of what Jane thought of it. Margaret would write that Jane loved Ulysses from the first moment, and said her comments on it in the magazine prove that. However, there is a Frederick Hoffman, who may have been writing at that time. I say may because it's hard to tell, and Google only brought up a mathematician involved with statistics. But this Frederick wrote Jane Heap obviously did not like Ulysses. He further said that she had little or no perspective for a judgment. Make of that what you will.
Have you been able to find the review, or?
No, because as I said, Google was not the most cooperative, and I do not think the mathematician it gave me is the same person at all.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it. So, who's to say?
On the odd art side of this time, Margaret and Jane also befriended the Baroness Elsa von Freytag Lorenhoven, she who wore a dress of red beets and other vegetables long before Lady Gaga's meat dress or Baldur's Gate 3's or in the Red's armor. If you are confused, there is an episode on the Baroness from some time back. Jane and Margaret published her poetry and continued to do so even when she stole $5 worth of stamps from them.
Ooh, shocking. Baroness stealing stamps.
I mean, it's not that shocking considering it's Elsa.
Well, if people want to know more, they know where to find it. She's got some greats on here. Who else is she? Or who else are they taking on?
Well, there is the complicated relationship they have with Juna Barnes. They do publish some of her work, but Jane and Juna were rumored to have been lovers in 1918 and 1919. Now, I could not find good sources for if that happened or not. The only written account of it is apparently from Mabel Dodge's third husband, Maurice Stern, a one-time lover of Juna's. Stern wrote that while he and Juna were out to dinner one night, Juna recognized Margaret Anderson and hissed, "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you," at her, to which Margaret only smiled sweetly.
Ooh.
It appears to have been a quiet fight of charged eyeball movements that ended with Juna stalking out the door. Supposedly, they were fighting over Jane, whom Juna referred to as a shit in 1938.
They are using serious language.
The biographer Andrea Barnett posits that the affair might have ended badly then, if it did indeed occur. Other books only make mention of a rumor that Juno hated Margaret for stealing Jane away from her, which, to be honest, I would like to know the logistics of how that is supposed to have happened when Jane and Margaret got together in Chicago and only years later moved to New York. There's either teleportation involved or something is missing here.
Well, Sapphics and long distance. Maybe they were writing letters.
Well, I do wonder if it's a case similar to Natalie Barney of Jane having more than one lover at a time, but I don't think so considering how we see her react to when Margaret gets together with Georgette later on.
Although also early Natalie Barney was not keen on her lovers having lovers, so...
True, but it's just... There's a lot here that seems to be missing, so I have a difficult time believing that this affair either happened or that it happened in 1918 and 1919. As the magazine reached its 10-year anniversary, Margaret told Jane that she didn't want to continue with the magazine. Jane disagreed. She argued it was important to keep the magazine open for the art that no one else would take, like Dadaist novels and Juna Barnes' edgy short stories.
Well, she would say that, wouldn't she?
Anyway, their argument dragged on for weeks. A few months later, Margaret left Jane for the singer Georgette LeBlanc.
Oh, dang, that's sudden. I mean, we've been hearing about them bickering and arguing and, having little tiffs, but this sounds like it was serious.
Well, as you'll recall from Margaret's episode when she met Georgette, things progressed rather quickly and the whole flamboyance and whatnot. Also, the fact that I haven't seen many people dive deeply into Margaret and Jane's personal relationship and what was going on behind closed doors when the magazine was done being produced and whatnot, so things could have been declining for a while.
We just don't know.
What we do know is that as a result, from 1924 to 1927, Jane Heap basically published the Little Review on her own. In 1926, she opened a gallery at 66th Street and 5th Avenue as an addition to the magazine and mounted the first show of the Russian constructivist stage sets in America. From this section, it sounds like while we've seen Jane, along with Margaret and Georgette, follow the mystic Gurdjieff to France in 1923, Jane didn't spend all of her time in France. It sounds like she either split her time between Paris and New York, or moved back to the States soon after leaving for France.
So she wasn't completely enthralled by the mystic like some others.
From what I recall, Jane rather quickly devised a set of questions to get at the heart of what he was talking about so that she did not spend a great deal of time in his group.
Ah, the analytical brain.
That said, she just continued to spend time with that movement. In 1929, Jane concluded the last issue of the Little Review with Margaret in France. Now, this isn't chronological, but I do feel we need to bring up what Sherry Benstock talks about, namely how the Little Review succeeded in Margaret's eyes because of Jane. Jane is the one to have created a formula for the magazine, which goes, "To express the emotions of life is to live. To express the life of emotions is to make art." Benstock does make a comparison to the magazine Egoist that launched roughly at the same time but failed. She makes a point to mention the publishing of avant-garde French writers as a factor in this, but I find it difficult to determine how much of that choice is from Heap. Also, Jane is the one to limit Pound's control of the magazine after the New York move when she gained more editorial power as Margaret started to want out. That said, Jane did defend Ezra Pound's work showing up in the magazine.
Okay, so she was the one to argue for moderation in Pound's involvement, I guess.
Yes, he should not be allowed to take over the magazine, just as a woman who wanted to back the Little Review before that was turned down by Margaret in fear that she would try to take over the magazine. Also, despite the breakup and closing down of the Little Review, Jane and Margaret were partially legally tied.
I did not think this could get more complicated. What's going on?
Margaret's sister was unable to care for her two sons after a series of breakdowns, so she gave them to Margaret, who didn't want to be a surrogate mother. Jane, on the other hand, adopted them. Not much is mentioned about them beyond this fact, and that Jane did take them on her trips to France. They do show up in her correspondence with Florence Reynolds, but I did not have access to the entirety of that volume, unfortunately.
But we do, in fact, know that not only were they long-term partners and had kind of an alimony situation going on, but they also had kids together.
To a weird extent, yes. Which you'll see actually as we go on in this world is not as rare as you would think. Jane is continuing to be around both Margaret and Gurdjieff in the 30s. You remember that group that Solito Solano became a secretary for? Both Jane and Margaret were a part of it. There is also a brief mention I found of Jane being the lover of the British founding editor of Vogue, Elspeth Champcommunal, a name I have difficulty with because it looked simultaneously French and English. As I only had access to snippets of the book this is mentioned in, specifically the published letters of Jane Heap and Florence Reynolds, I cannot give you much detail about that relationship. It does appear that it continued into World War II, though. Speaking of, when the 1930s came to a close and World War II began, Jane ended up in London. She remained there after the war and received the interest from a family trust that belonged to her old friend, Florence Reynolds, after Reynolds' death from cancer in 1949. Heap herself would die of complications of diabetes in 1964 at approximately age 80. She never published any of her other ideas aside from what appeared in the Little Review. I will say prior to this episode, I didn't realize how little about Jane Heap there is. Like, she's the second half of the Little Review, yet everything I'd come across for years focused on Margaret Anderson instead.
It seems like Jane is kind of playing a supporting role here, and Margaret likes to be the front man of the operation. Jane can kind of play the drums in the background.
Thanks for listening. We post new episodes every month, so subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice to learn more about the female artists, writers, and hangers-on that made up the Paris Lesbos subculture. We love hearing from you in YouTube comments, and we appreciate your tips on who to research next. And remember, lesbian teleportation is real, and it will ruin your relationships.